The wind that night was sharp enough to peel skin. It swept through the barren hills of Montana like a ghost with unfinished business. The ranch lights of Hollow Creek flickered in the distance, but for miles around nothing moved except a girl tied to a fence post. Her name was Clara Densmore, the youngest daughter of a cruel ranch foreman who thought obedience could be beaten into anything that breathed. Her dress was torn where the men had dragged her, her wrists raw where the rope bit through skin. The moonlight touched her face, pale, bruised, and trembling, but her eyes still burned, fierce with that old Densmore fire that refused to die, even when the world turned its back. Clara had worked since she was 10, mending fences, branding cattle, cleaning the bunkhouse. The men called her the Mule Girl, and her father laughed along, proud of the nickname. When her mother died, Clara became the house's ghost, silent, obedient, useful. But that night she'd done something unforgivable. She'd stood between her father and a bleeding mare, refusing to let him strike it again. The men had watched, unsure whether to intervene, until her father's hand turned to a fist. One of them, her cousin Seth, had spat and muttered, "Teach her manners." And so they'd done exactly that. Dragged her through the mud, tied her to the corner fence post where the dead trees began, and left her there as punishment, in the cold rain that soon followed. Hours passed. Her lips cracked from the wind. The thunder rolled low like a warning drum, and she thought maybe she'd die there alone with the smell of blood and iron in her mouth. She prayed not for rescue, but for forgiveness, for all the wild words she'd said before her mother's grave. Then, through the curtain of rain came the faint sound of hooves. Slow, steady, not like a galloping ranch hand or a bandit's rush, more like someone who didn't need to hurry, someone who'd seen enough pain to recognize it from miles away. The rider was tall, wrapped in a worn duster, hat low against the rain. His horse was black as midnight, its breath fogging the air. He stopped when he saw her. For a long moment neither of them moved, just the wind howling around them. Then he dismounted, boots sinking in the mud, and walked to her with a silence that carried more weight than words ever could. His knife flashed once, clean and sure, slicing through the rope. She crumpled forward, but he caught her before she hit the ground. He didn't ask who she was or what had happened. He just lifted her onto his horse and wrapped her in his coat. His hands were rough, scarred, but careful, as if he feared she might vanish if he held too tightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was weak, barely there. "Why'd you stop?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just looked at her from beneath the brim of his hat. "Because I couldn't ride past," he said finally, his voice deep and steady, carrying a sorrow she couldn't name. As the rain poured harder, he guided the horse toward the hills away from Hollow Creek. She clung to him, not out of trust but because her body had no strength left to fight. Each step of the horse felt like a heartbeat against eternity. She didn't know his name. He didn't ask for hers. But when she looked up once, the lightning flashed across his face, and she saw eyes that weren't cruel, weren't cold, just tired. A man who had seen enough of life to recognize its ugliness. When they reached the small cabin at the edge of the ridge, he helped her down, carried her inside, and lit the fire with the ease of someone who lived alone long enough to forget conversation. She noticed the quiet around him, not the awkward silence of men unsure what to say, but a deliberate kind. Like words had failed him once, and he'd never trusted them again. She sat by the fire, trembling, watching the flames dance shadows on the walls. He handed her a blanket, then crouched near the stove, tending to the pot as if it were a ritual. "You live alone?" she asked after a while. He nodded once. "You a cowboy?" Another nod. "Got a name?" He hesitated, then said softly, "Luke." The sound of it filled the room like something ancient, simple, steady, and safe. Luke. She held it in her mind as if it were a promise she didn't yet understand. He gave her water, patched her wrists, then stepped outside without a word. When he came back, he hung her torn dress near the fire to dry. She wanted to thank him, but the words got lost between gratitude and shame. What could she say? That she'd been beaten for loving too much, for refusing cruelty? That her family was the kind that punished tenderness like a sin? Instead, she said nothing. The silence grew, soft but not empty, like the hush after a hymn. When she finally slept, Luke sat across the room, staring into the flames. The rain hammered the roof, each drop echoing in the hollowness of his chest. He thought of another night years ago, another woman left broken by the hands of men who claimed to love her. He'd arrived too late then. He hadn't saved her. Maybe this was his second chance, or maybe he was just trying to atone for a ghost that still followed him through every mile of open land. Outside, dawn crawled over the hills, washing away the storm. The fence post where he'd found her stood crooked in the mud, the cut rope fluttering like a white flag of surrender. But for Luke and Clara, something else had begun, something fragile and wordless. A bond born from rescue, but rooted in a sorrow they both carried in silence. He didn't know her story yet, and she didn't know his. But both understood one truth that morning. In a world as cruel as theirs, kindness could be the most dangerous act of all. The storm broke by morning, but the air still carried the smell of wet earth and smoke. Clara woke in the cabin, her body heavy with bruises and her heart heavier still. The fire had burned low, and the sound of a horse outside told her she wasn't dreaming. There was a man who'd cut her loose, and this wasn't another cruel joke from her father's men. The blanket around her was thick and smelled faintly of leather and pine. It made her feel safe in a way she hadn't in years, though she didn't know if she deserved safety anymore. Luke was already outside, chopping wood with steady, practiced movements. His coat hung from a hook soaked from the night's rain. He worked in silence, muscles shifting beneath the worn fabric of his shirt, each swing deliberate but not angry. There was a patience in him that unsettled her. Patience belonged to men who weren't in a hurry to prove something. Most ranchmen she'd known swung axes like they were punishing the world. But Luke's calm was different, deep like still water. When he came inside, the morning light caught his eyes. They were gray, not the sharp gray of steel, but the weary gray of a sky before snow. He nodded at her as if greeting her in silence was enough. She tried to speak, to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Her tongue was swollen from thirst. Seeing her struggle, he poured water into a tin cup and handed it over without a word. She drank greedily, then whispered hoarsely, "You didn't have to stop last night." He shrugged, set the axe aside, and said in that low voice of his, "Didn't figure anyone else would." That was the first real thing he said to her, and it stuck in her heart like a seed. Didn't figure anyone else would. He wasn't rescuing her out of heroism. He just couldn't leave someone behind. Maybe that's what decency meant in a place as hard as the Montana hills, doing right because no one else would. As the days passed, Clara healed slowly. The welts on her wrists turned to scabs. The bruises on her ribs faded to yellow. Luke didn't pry into her past, though she knew he was curious. Instead, he built quiet moments between them, bringing her coffee in the mornings, letting her sit on the porch while he worked with his horse, or leaving books beside the chair by the fire. She tried to read, but the words blurred sometimes, and she found herself watching him instead. He had the stillness of a man who'd known too much noise once. Sometimes at night she'd hear him pacing outside as if haunted by something unseen. He never went far, though. Never out of hearing distance. It wasn't long before she began to talk, small pieces of her story spilling out between chores. "Pa don't like me much," she said one morning, peeling potatoes by the fire. "Said I got too much of my ma in me." She was soft, and softness don't last long on a ranch. Luke didn't answer, just kept mending the saddle in his hands, the rhythm of his work grounding her words. Another day, she said, "I don't hate him. I think that's worse. I just stopped expecting him to be anything else." Luke finally looked up at that. "Sometimes expecting less of someone is the only way to stay alive," he said, then went back to stitching. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot near the fire, watching the flames flicker across his face as he sat carving a piece of wood. "What about you?" she asked softly. "You got a family?" He hesitated, then said, "Used to." She waited, but he didn't go on. His hand tightened around the carving knife, and she saw his jaw clench just enough to know the wound was still fresh, even if years had passed. She wanted to ask more, but something in his silence told her not to. Some stories were like open wounds. You don't touch them unless you're ready to bleed too. Over time, the rhythm of the cabin became their language. He'd light the fire before dawn. She'd brew the coffee. She learned the way he liked his beans cooked, and he learned when to let her cry without asking why. One afternoon, she found herself humming a tune her mother used to sing, and Luke paused in the doorway, watching her like the song was a ghost he recognized. "You sing pretty," he murmured. She blushed. "Ain't sung in a long time." "Sounded like something worth remembering," he said, then stepped back out to the yard. The snow came early that year, thick and quiet. They built walls of firewood and stored dried meat and beans. He showed her how to use the rifle, though she trembled every time she touched it. "It's not for hurting," he told her. "It's for protecting what's yours." "What if I ain't got anything left that's mine?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time before saying, "Then start here," and so she did. She swept the cabin, tended the fire, mended his shirts, and began to call the place home. Not because it was hers, but because for the first time, no one raised a hand against her there. She'd glance at him sometimes and wonder what he was paying penance for, what sin he carried that made him so gentle with her, but she never asked. She knew what guilt looked like. It had eyes just like his, steady, gray, and full of ghosts. Then one night, when the wind was howling and the snow cut across the windows, she woke to find him sitting by the fire, staring into the flames again. There was something different in his face, resignation maybe, or fear. "Luke," she whispered, pulling the blanket tighter, "you ever think some folks ain't meant to be saved?" He turned to her slowly. "Don't matter what we think," he said. "You save who you can. Sometimes that's someone else. Sometimes it's yourself." The silence stretched long after that, but it wasn't empty. It was full of everything neither of them could say. The gratitude, the longing, the ache of two broken souls who'd found each other in the ashes of their pain. As the fire died down, Clara watched him stand and walk to the window. His reflection flickered against the glass, half shadow, half flame. "You'll heal," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "You'll go when you're ready. Don't stay for me." But in her heart she already knew she couldn't leave, not yet, maybe not ever, and that's when she realized rescue doesn't end when the ropes are cut. Sometimes it begins right after. The snow thawed slow that spring, reluctant to let go of the hills. For weeks, Clara and Luke lived in the rhythm of quiet survival, mending, feeding, healing. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a place where silence spoke of safety instead of fear. But peace in the wilds of Montana was never meant to last. Shadows travel fast on the prairie wind, and one day, those shadows found them. It began with hoofprints. Luke noticed them first. 4 horses, maybe 5, coming from the south trail that led nowhere except Hollow Creek. He didn't say anything to Clara at first. Just checked the rifle twice that morning and stared longer at the horizon. But Clara saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he stopped humming while working. She asked what was wrong, and he only said, "Might be riders passing through." Yet something in his voice made her heart drop. She knew that kind of unease. Men who rode with purpose rarely carried good news. 2 days later they came. 5 men, all wearing dusted hats and hard expressions, rode up to the cabin while Luke was chopping wood and Clara was hanging washed clothes near the porch. She froze the moment she recognized the one in front, her cousin Seth. His smirk hadn't changed, though his eyes were meaner than before. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled. "Pa said you'd gone and froze to death, Clara. Guess hell wasn't ready for you yet." Her throat tightened, but before she could speak, Luke stepped between them. "You lost?" His voice was calm but carried a quiet edge. Seth chuckled. "Just collecting what's ours. That girl there, she belongs to Hollow Creek Ranch, ain't that right, Clara?" He looked at her with that same cruel amusement that had once tied her to a fence post. "You best come home before Pa decides to ride here himself." Clara's hands shook. "Home?" she whispered. "That place stopped being home the night you left me out there." Seth shrugged, glancing at Luke. "You found yourself a savior, huh?" "Quiet type. Ain't that sweet, but you know how this works. She's property, mister. My uncle raised her, fed her. That debt don't disappear just 'cause you untied a few knots." Luke's face didn't change. "You best leave," he said simply. "Ain't nothing here for you." The silence that followed was the kind that stretched before a storm breaks. Then Seth spat in the snow and grinned. "You don't scare me, Cowboy." Luke didn't reply, just stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the world seemed to narrow down to the space between them. Clara could feel the air shift, thick with memory and fear. For a second, she saw the man behind Luke's calm, the one who'd fought before, maybe killed before, and carried that weight like a scar on his soul. Seth's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. One muttered something about not wanting trouble. Seth sneered, but finally turned his horse. "You can keep her for now," he said. "But Hollow Creek don't forget debts. And Pa, he don't forgive 'em." With that, they rode off, dust trailing behind them like ghosts. When the last hoofbeat faded, Clara sank to her knees. Luke knelt beside her, his hand hovering before resting gently on her shoulder. "You don't owe them anything," he said softly. She looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "They'll come back, Luke, he always does." He nodded once, eyes distant. "Then we'll be ready." That night, neither of them slept much. Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames, remembering the way her father's belt had felt across her back, the laughter of men who thought pain made people obedient. Luke sat across from her, oiling the rifle, lost in thought. Finally, she asked, "You ever lose someone because of men like them?" He didn't look up. "A wife," he said quietly. "Years back. Some drunk ranchers thought they could have what wasn't theirs. I came back too late." The words hung heavy in the air. "Ain't been much of a man since," he added. "Just a shadow passing through places." Clara's heart broke a little for him then. "You saved me," she said. "That makes you more of a man than most." He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, fragile but alive. Not lust, not pity. Something deeper, like two wounds recognizing each other's shape. Over the next few days, Luke began reinforcing the cabin, adding boards to the doors, sharpening tools, setting traps along the back trail. Clara helped, though her hands still trembled from fear. She wanted to believe they could stay hidden, that the world could forget her. But Hollow Creek didn't forget its ghosts. One afternoon, while Luke was out checking traps, Clara found herself wandering to the ridge behind the cabin. The view stretched endlessly, mountains biting into clouds. Freedom, she thought, was just another kind of loneliness. She wondered if Luke would ever let her leave, or if she even wanted to. When she heard the faint echo of gunfire from the woods below, her heart stopped. She ran. By the time she reached him, Luke was crouched behind a fallen log, rifle in hand, breathing hard. Two horses stood loose nearby, their riders nowhere in sight. He looked up when she appeared, a flash of panic in his eyes. "I told you to stay inside. I thought you were quiet," he hissed. Then she heard it too, footsteps crunching in the underbrush. A man emerged, pistol drawn, his voice slurred with whiskey. "Ain't no use hiding, Cowboy. Mr. Densmore wants his girl back." Luke didn't answer. The world seemed to freeze the way it does right before a heart breaks. One shot rang out, then another. The birds scattered, screaming into the sky. When it was over, the man lay still in the snow, a dark stain spreading beneath him. Luke stood motionless, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle. Clara stared, chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. "He would have killed you," Luke said, voice low but shaking. "He would have taken you back." She stepped forward, touching his arm. "You didn't have a choice." But he pulled away, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "There's always a choice," he muttered. "I keep making the wrong ones." They buried the man at the edge of the forest before nightfall. No prayers, no words, just silence. Clara's hands were numb as she helped cover the grave. But when Luke took off his hat and stood over it, she saw tears glint in the fading light. He'd carried too much loss already. She wished she could lift even a fragment of it. That night, after the fire had burned low, Clara reached for his hand. "Luke," she whispered, "you're not the only one who's done things they regret." He turned to her, eyes dark with guilt and exhaustion. "Maybe," he said softly, "but you still got something I lost a long time ago." "What's that?" "Hope." She didn't know how to answer that, so she leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. The world outside was cold and cruel, but for a few stolen hours they were two souls suspended in the quiet between storms, and though neither said it out loud, they both knew this peace wouldn't last. Shadows had long memories, and somewhere out there, Hollow Creek's men were already saddling their horses again. The days after the gunfight were heavy with silence. Luke spoke little, and when he did, his words were weighted with something deeper than guilt, something like prophecy. He'd seen violence before, but never with her watching. Clara tried to act strong, chopping wood and tending the fire as if routine could patch the cracks forming between them. But each time she caught him staring at his hands or cleaning the rifle long after it was spotless, her heart ached. He was a man wrestling his own ghost, and she feared the ghost was winning. By late spring, the thaw gave way to the scent of wildflowers and distant smoke. Luke noticed it first, a faint gray line curling above the trees to the south. Hollow Creek. He stood on the ridge for a long time, eyes fixed on the horizon. Clara joined him, clutching her shawl tight. "They're coming, aren't they?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but the way his jaw tightened was answer enough. That night, while the wind howled through the pines, Luke finally spoke. "If they find this place, it won't end quiet." His voice was steady but resigned. "Your father won't stop till he gets what he thinks he owns. I can't keep you safe here forever." Clara looked at him across the firelight, her face pale but determined. "Then I'll go to him. End it myself." He shook his head sharply. "No, you don't face wolves by walking into their den." Tears burned in her eyes. "Luke, if you die because of me." He stood, cutting her off. "Don't say that. You didn't ask for saving. I just couldn't ride past." The words hit her like they had that first night. Only now they carried the weight of love he couldn't bring himself to admit. She wanted to tell him she didn't need saving anymore, that she needed him. But the look in his eyes silenced her. He'd already decided something. She could feel it in the way his voice softened when he said her name, as if saying goodbye without the words. At dawn he saddled his horse, the same black stallion that had carried her from the Fencepost months before. Clara woke to the sound of hoofbeats and ran outside barefoot, the cold biting her skin. "Where are you going?" she cried. He paused, reins tight in his hand. "To end it," he said simply. "To keep it from coming here." She grabbed his arm, eyes wide. "You'll die, Luke." He looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe. But I'd rather meet death standing than watch it crawl to your door." Before she could stop him, he rode off into the pale morning. His figure grew smaller against the hills until it vanished entirely. Clara stood there, shaking, the echo of hoofbeats fading like a heartbeat gone still. Luke rode hard through the forest, every hoofbeat pounding with memory. His wife's face, the gunshots that took her, the silence afterward. Maybe this was how it had to end. Maybe saving Clara was the only thing left he could do right. By the time he reached the edge of Hollow Creek, the town lay quiet beneath the smoke of its own cruelty. The Densmore Ranch loomed ahead, its fences high, its windows glowing with lamplight. He didn't sneak or hide. He rode straight down the road, dust rising behind him. Men turned to stare. Some recognized him from the trails, a quiet cowboy who never stayed long anywhere. Others just saw trouble coming and stepped aside. Inside the house, her father looked up from his chair when Luke pushed open the door. "You," the old man growled, rising. "You got nerve riding here after stealing my blood." Luke's eyes were calm. "I didn't steal nothing. You threw her away." The men in the room stiffened. Guns shifted in their holsters. Seth was there too, grinning that same snake grin. "You think you're a hero, cowboy?" He sneered. "She ain't worth dying for." Luke's voice dropped low, cold as riverstone. "Maybe not to you, but she's worth something to me." Before anyone could draw, Luke's gun was up. The room exploded into chaos, wood splintering, glass shattering, the thunder of bullets in tight quarters. When the smoke cleared, 2 men were down. Seth was bleeding from his arm, cursing. Luke stood breathing hard, a line of blood trailing from his shoulder. Her father raised his shotgun, but Luke fired first. The blast threw the old man back, the weapon slipping from his grasp. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackle of lantern flames licking at the floorboards. Then the fire caught. Luke staggered out of the house as it began to burn, the orange glow lighting the night behind him. His vision blurred, but he stayed on his feet long enough to reach his horse. Smoke curled into the sky, black, thick, rising like judgment. Miles away, Clara saw it too. The plume of fire on the horizon turned her stomach cold. Without thinking, she grabbed the rifle and ran for her mare, riding hard toward the flames, her hair whipped loose in the wind, tears freezing on her cheeks. She found him near the ridge, slumped in the saddle, blood soaking through his shirt. "Luke!" she screamed, leaping off her horse. He tried to smile when he saw her. "Told you not to come," he murmured, his voice breaking. She caught him as he slid from the saddle, her arms wrapping around him, pulling him down to the cold earth. "You're hurt," she sobbed. "Been worse," he whispered, though the blood on his lips said otherwise. She pressed her hand against the wound, trembling. "Why'd you do it?" He looked up at her, the fire from Hollow Creek reflecting in his gray eyes. "Because some things need ending," he said softly. "And some folks need saving, even if it cost you the rest of yourself." She shook her head, tears falling fast.
No, don't you say that.
"You can't leave me now." He smiled faintly. "You'll be all right, Clara. You were strong before I found you." "No," she cried, gripping his hand. "You made me remember what being alive felt like." He closed his eyes, his breathing shallow. "Then don't forget it," he whispered. The fire on the horizon roared louder, painting the sky in blood and gold. She held him until the last of his breath left in a sigh so quiet it almost sounded like peace. When dawn came, the smoke had drifted far across the plains. Clara buried him beneath the ridge overlooking the valley, where the wildflowers grew each spring. She marked the grave with his knife, blade deep in the soil. As she stood there, wind whipping through her hair, she whispered, "You didn't ride past, Luke. You stopped, and I'll never forget." Then she turned, leading his horse toward the sunrise the same way he'd come months ago through the lonely hills that had once been her prison. Only now they were her road. Spring returned like a slow forgiveness. The snows melted from the ridge first, uncovering the earth where she'd buried him. Tiny yellow blossoms had pushed through the soil there, swaying in the wind as if bowing to something greater than grief. Clara visited every dawn, bringing coffee in a tin cup and sitting beside the mound as the valley breathed below. Sometimes she talked aloud as if Luke could still hear her. Other times she just sat in silence, letting the morning birds carry the words she couldn't speak. It had been 3 months since the fire at Hollow Creek. The town had changed, though not out of remorse. The Densmore name had burned with the ranch. Her father's men scattered, some dead, some fled, some pretending none of it ever happened. Seth survived, but rumor said he left Montana altogether, too ashamed or too haunted to stay. Clara didn't ask which. She didn't care. The land was quiet now, and quiet, she'd learned, could be both a balm and a wound. She'd stayed in Luke's cabin, keeping it just as he left it. The walls still smelled faintly of pine and smoke, the old coffee pot blackened from years of use. Sometimes when the wind blew through the eaves just right, it sounded like his low hum, that soft tune he used to whistle while fixing the saddle. She'd pause her chores and close her eyes, pretending for a heartbeat that he was still there, watching her from the porch with that steady, wordless gaze. In the months after his death, she changed. The girl who once flinched at every sound was gone. The woman who remained moved with a quiet certainty. She learned to ride alone, to mend fences, to hunt small game when she had to. She carried the rifle he taught her to use and wore his old duster on cold mornings. It was too big for her, but she liked the weight. It felt like memory, heavy but comforting. One morning she found a letter wedged behind the stove. The envelope was weathered, the ink faded, but her name was there in his handwriting, Clara. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't come back. Don't mourn me too long. The world's cruel, but it's also wide, and you've got a heart big enough to carry both. I once thought silence was safer than love. You proved me wrong. Don't let this land break you. Build something here, even if it's just peace."
Luke. She read it until the words blurred through her tears.
Then she folded it carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket, close to her heart. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, she walked to his grave again. "I got your letter," she whispered. "You were right, Luke, this land's cruel. But I'm still here, and maybe that's what love means, staying when you could have left." She stayed like that for a while, talking to him about the little things, how the river was running strong again, how the mare had foaled, how the coyotes sang louder at night now that the valley was theirs. It made her feel less alone. The world had taken too much already. She refused to give it her silence, too. That summer, strangers began to pass through. Travelers, trappers, lost ranch hands. Some stopped at her cabin for water or a warm meal. They called her the quiet widow on the ridge. She didn't correct them. Maybe that's what she was now. But when they asked who the man in the grave was, she smiled faintly and said, "The one who remembered kindness when everyone else forgot." One night, an older couple stopped by. The woman, thin and weathered by years of sun, looked around the cabin and said softly, "This used to be Luke Mallory's place, didn't it?" Clara froze. "You knew him?" The woman nodded. "My husband worked a drive with him once. Said Luke was the kind of man who never spoke unless it mattered." "That sounds like him," Clara whispered. The woman's eyes softened. He carried grief with him, but not bitterness. "I always hoped he'd find someone who could see the good in him." Clara smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "He did, just didn't last long enough." After they left, she sat on the porch for hours, the stars bright above her. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and rain. She thought about what the woman said, how Luke carried grief without bitterness. Maybe that was the lesson he'd left her, that surviving wasn't about forgetting pain, but walking with it without letting it harden you. Autumn came, turning the hills gold. The wildflowers on his grave bloomed one last time before the frost. Clara harvested them gently, tying them into small bundles she left by the window. Each morning she spoke his name softly just once so the world wouldn't forget. As the first snow fell, she rode into town for supplies. People still looked at her with a mixture of pity and awe. She didn't mind. When she passed the ruins of Hollow Creek, all that remained were blackened timbers and the faint smell of ash. She dismounted, standing where the front porch once was, and whispered, "It's over." The wind carried the words away like a prayer. That night, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire and opened Luke's letter again. The edges were soft now, worn from being read too often. She traced each word with her finger, memorizing the loops of his handwriting the way he'd written her name like it mattered. Then she placed it beside the fire, not to burn it, but to keep it warm, because some things, she decided, shouldn't be buried cold. Years later, travelers would still talk about her. They'd say the widow on the ridge lived alone but was never lonely. That she sang sometimes in the evenings, a soft tune carried by the wind. And when they passed the hill covered in wildflowers, they'd swear they could hear a low hum, like a man's voice joining hers in harmony. They'd never know the full story. How a beaten ranch girl became a woman who built peace out of ashes. How a silent cowboy found redemption not in killing or saving, but in stopping for someone no one else would. And though time blurred their faces in memory, the land remembered. The fence post still stood, weathered and half-buried not far from where he'd first found her. The rope long gone, the scars of the wood softened by rain. The wild grass grew thick around it, and sometimes when the wind swept through, it sounded almost like laughter, or maybe forgiveness. Every spring, new flowers grew on the hill. Yellow, white, and violet. The locals said they came from nowhere, but Clara knew better. They were Luke's parting gift, the proof that even in the harshest soil, something tender could still bloom. And when her own time came years later, they buried her beside him, beneath that same open sky. No headstone, just wildflowers and the whisper of wind through pine. Two souls who never quite found peace in life but gave it to each other in the end. Because in the lonely expanse of the Montana plains, some love stories aren't meant to be loud or endless. They're meant to be like the land itself, quiet, vast, and eternal.